Welcome to another deep dive. We love getting to the heart of things, really pulling out those insights. And today we're diving into something pretty fascinating. It's Chapter 5, The Impartial Way, from the Built for Greatness, Built for God Movement Handbook. It's actually billed as like a Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, a Christian spin on ancient wisdom.
Exactly.
Should be interesting.
For sure. And what's really intriguing is how this chapter tries to kind of represent the gospel message, like a fresh take, a new expression, as they call it,
Yeah.
of God's love. And it's all geared towards restoring like these core truths.
Okay, I'm seeing a theme here, restore.
Yeah, you'll notice it throughout.
So how's this chapter actually laid out?
Well, they've broken it down into 3 sections. It starts with restore, which is the meat of chapter 5, the core concepts. Then it moves into renewal, which introduces a practical framework. They call it the Trinitarian method. And this is where they bring in mindset, aim, and practice, MAP, like a roadmap.
Okay, a roadmap for renewal. And then lastly, there's respond, where they explore parallel teachings in other religions, looking for that common ground, those universal threads.
So what are we really hoping to uncover today?
Well, for you, we really want to understand the central themes of this chapter. Impartiality, obviously, but also love, provision, generosity, even silence. All within this particular Christian context. And of course, we'll touch on those connections to other faiths.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in, starting with restore in chapter 5, the impartial way.
Right off the bat, the chapter hits you with this statement. It says, "Heaven and earth do not take sides. They allow both the righteous and unrighteous to exist."
Wow, that's pretty bold, right out the gate.
It is, and it immediately brings up this idea of impartiality, like at a fundamental level in the divine or maybe in the natural order of things. Now, the text does reference 1 Peter 3.18.
Okay, I have that here.
Yeah.
Talks about Christ suffering for sins.
Right. Now, the chapter doesn't directly link these two ideas, but it's interesting to consider. Maybe the underlying thought is that just as Christ's sacrifice was for everyone, so too is this allowance of existence for both the righteous and the unrighteous.
I see what you mean. It's not explicitly stated, but the idea of a universal offering, it definitely fits with that theme of impartiality.
Absolutely. But then the chapter goes on to reference Matthew 5.45.
Okay, let me find that. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous.
Exactly. And that provides a more direct link to the idea of God's common grace. Those blessings that are given freely to everyone, regardless of their actions or beliefs. It's a key foundation for this whole impartial way.
So it's like even the natural world doesn't discriminate. That really challenges us to think about our own judgments, doesn't it? If nature itself operates in this impartial way, what does that say about us when we tend to take sides?
It's a powerful question to consider. The chapter then moves on to talk about the Son of Man. It states that he, too, does not take sides. He loves both his neighbors and his enemies.
So taking that idea of impartiality and really personalizing it through the figure of Jesus.
Precisely. And again, we see some relevant scriptures here. Matthew 5.43 to 45, where Jesus tells us to love our enemies, and Matthew 20.28, which reminds us that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
So it's not just about being passively impartial, but actively extending that love, that service, to everyone, even those we might naturally see as opponents. It's a tough concept, really loving someone who may not love you back or who might even actively oppose you.
It is, but that's the radical nature of what the chapter is trying to convey. This love isn't earned or conditional. It's just given.
Okay, so we have this idea of impartiality from both heaven and earth and from the Son of Man. Then the chapter shifts to a different kind of image. It says, the space between heaven and earth is an endless source, empty, yet infinitely capable of all things.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting. The chapter uses this beautiful paradox. Emptiness, not as a void, but as a space full of potential. It ties this to God's infinite capacity, even referencing Matthew 19.26, where Jesus says, with God, all things are possible.
So that emptiness is actually a metaphor for God's power and presence, maybe unseen, but capable of anything.
Makes you think about how we often view emptiness, doesn't it? Do we see it as a lack or as a space for potential?
It's a great point, and this idea of emptiness as potential is also found in other philosophies and traditions. But here, the theological framing is distinctly Christian.
Okay, so we have impartiality, the potential within emptiness, and then the chapter introduces the principle of reciprocity. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you and even more. This seems like a universal idea, right? You see it in a lot of different wisdom traditions. Oh, absolutely. And the chapter grounds it in Mark 4.24-25, where Jesus talks about being attentive to what you hear, because the measure you give is the measure you will receive, plus more. It interprets this as a teaching about generosity and the consequences of our actions.
Right, like a spiritual cause and effect.
Yeah.
What you put out comes back to you.
Exactly. If we're generous, not just with material things, but also with our spirit, our interactions, the idea is that we'll experience abundance in return. That might mean material wealth, but also that spiritual and relational richness.
Okay, so we've got impartiality, potential, reciprocity, and then the last thing the restore section touches on is silence. Too many words lead to confusion. It is better to keep silent. Boy, does that ever resonate in today's world, right? Where everyone's constantly talking and posting and sharing.
It really does, and the chapter offers several scriptural references here. Proverbs 10.19, Job 35.16, Proverbs 17.27-28, and James 1.26-27. Although in the summary, it specifically mentions James 1.19-20. But all these verses, they really highlight the potential for words to cause harm, misunderstanding, even sin.
So it's not just about being quiet for quiet's sake.
No, it's about intentionality. Knowing when to hold back, when silence might be the most powerful response.
Okay, so that's the restore section, laying out these core principles. Then the chapter moves into renewal, and this is where it introduces the Trinitarian method, the MAP mindset, aim, and practice.
Right. The MAP framework, it's all about taking those foundational ideas from Restore and actually integrating them into your life. It suggests that real, genuine renewal comes from aligning your thinking, your intentions, and your actions with God's love, trust in the Son, and faith in the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so let's break it down, starting with mindset. How should we be thinking about these principles? Let's start with that first one, impartial love and grace.
So the handbook says the mindset here is to cultivate impartiality and patience. Recognize that God allows both good and bad in the world. Our role isn't to judge, but to love as God loves. And it points back to Matthew 5.45, that image of God's blessings raining down on everyone.
So actively choosing to see things through a more impartial lens, mirroring what the chapter describes as God's perspective.
Exactly. And then for the principle of unconditional love, loving your neighbors and enemies, the mindset is to adopt an attitude of unconditional love.
Like making it your default setting.
Right. Remember, Jesus' love wasn't based on conditions. Our love shouldn't be either. And it references Matthew 5.44 again, love your enemies.
Wow, that's hard.
It is, but it's about forgiveness, reconciliation, letting go of those grudges, choosing love even when it's hard.
Okay, so that's two. What about trusting in God's infinite provision? That idea of the endless, empty, yet capable space. What's the mindset there?
The chapter calls it embracing trust in God's infinite provision. It's that belief that even when things seem scarce or empty, God's working with limitless power. And it uses Philippians 4.1, God will meet all your needs.
So instead of focusing on what we lack, we choose to trust in God's abundance.
Right, it's about shifting that perspective. Then, for the principle of generosity and reciprocity, with the measure you use, the mindset is to adopt a generous and forgiving spirit.
Leading with an open hand and a forgiving heart.
Absolutely. And it reminds us of Luke 6.38. Give, and it will be given to you. It's about understanding that how we treat others influences how we're treated, both by God and others.
Okay, and finally, for the power of silence, where too many words lead to confusion, what's the suggested mindset?
It's to practice mindfulness and the discipline of silence, to understand the power of our words and when it's better to say less. And it uses James 1.19, be quick to listen, slow to speak. It's about that internal awareness of what we say and how we say it.
So really cultivating these specific attitudes.
Right. And that leads us into the next part, aim. What are our intentions based on these mindsets?
Right. So now we're talking about purpose, not just how we think. So for impartial love and grace, what's the aim?
The handbook says the aim is to reflect God's impartial love and grace, embracing all people regardless of their actions or beliefs. It's that conscious decision to love without judgment. And again, it references Matthew 5.45.
Taking that internal shift and turning it into an outward purpose. What about for unconditional love?
The aim is to love unconditionally, following the example of Christ who loved both his neighbors and his enemies.
Actively choosing to imitate Christ's love, even when it's difficult.
Exactly. And Matthew 5.44 is the key verse there. Then for trusting in God's infinite provision, the aim is to trust in God's provision, recognizing that he can provide for all our needs from his infinite supply.
Okay, so intentionally choosing to rely on God's resources, especially in times of need.
Yes, and they bring in Philippians 4:19 again for that one. Then, for practicing generosity and reciprocity, the aim is to practice generosity knowing that what we give will be returned to us in greater measure. It's about consciously choosing to be a giver, both materially and spiritually. And the supporting verse is Luke 6:38.
So it's a deliberate intention, not just something that happens by chance.
Exactly. And finally, for the power of silence, the aim is to embrace the power of silence and listen more than we speak. It's about that intention to really listen, to use words thoughtfully for the benefit of others. And the reference there is James 1:19.
Okay, so we've set our internal compass with mindset, charted our course with aim, and now we get to the actual doing, the practice. How do we actually implement these intentions in our daily lives?
This is where the rubber meets the road. So for reflecting impartial love and grace, the practice is to practice showing impartial love and grace to all people, regardless of their actions or beliefs.
Okay, so putting it into action, not just feeling it, but actually doing it. What does that look like?
It's about actively demonstrating love toward those who might hurt or disagree with us. It could mean offering kindness instead of judgment, extending forgiveness, things like that. And they bring in Romans 2:11 here. God does not show favoritism.
Okay, so active steps toward living out that impartiality. What about for unconditional love? How do we practice that?
The practice is to love both those who are close to you and those who are difficult to love.
Mhm.
It encourages specific actions like extending forgiveness, praying for them, those sorts of things. And it uses Luke 6:27-28 as a guide. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Really challenging stuff.
It is. Okay, what about for trusting in God's provision? How do we make that a practice?
The practice is to trust God's provision for your life, knowing that He can fill any emptiness with His abundance. Focus on faith, not fear, during tough times. Practice contentment, trust in God's plan.
And the reference there is?
Matthew 6:31-33, seek first His kingdom, making that trust an active part of how we live.
Got it. And for practicing generosity and reciprocity, what's the practice?
The practice is practice generosity with your time, resources, and compassion, knowing it will come back to you in abundance. It encourages intentional giving, whether it's through charity, helping others, or just showing kindness.
Actively looking for ways to give.
Exactly. And they use 2 Corinthians 9:6 here, whoever sows generously. And then lastly, for embracing the power of silence, the practice is practice silence, listening more than speaking, and using words for edification.
So, being a better listener, thinking before we speak, making sure our words are constructive.
Precisely. And the verse they offer for reflection here is Proverbs 17:28. Even fools are thought-wise if they keep silent.
It's about actively cultivating that discipline of silence.
Yeah.
And using our words wisely.
Right.
Okay, so we've walked through the entire MAP framework. Now, the chapter concludes with a response section.
Yes, and this section is all about exploring parallel teachings in other religions.
What's the point of making those connections?
Well, the chapter wants to show that these principles, impartial love, unconditional love, trust, generosity, silence, and often, they aren't just Christian ideas, they're reflected in other major faiths too.
So it's about finding common ground, highlighting those shared human values.
Exactly, and it suggests that this can help us understand each other better, appreciate different belief systems, and ultimately work together more effectively.
Okay, so let's take each principle and see what parallels the chapter highlights. Let's start with impartial love and grace.
Okay, so along with Matthew 5:45 and Luke 6:35, they draw a parallel to the Buddhist Metta Sutta, which basically expresses a wish for all beings to be happy and free from suffering.
Okay, so kind of universal well-wishing. What else?
From Islam, they point to Quran 2.256, which states, "There shall be no compulsion in acceptance of the religion." So an emphasis on freedom of belief.
Interesting. And anything from Hinduism?
Yes, they use Bhagavad Gita 5.18, which talks about the wise seeing all beings with an equal eye.
So that impartial perspective again. What about for unconditional love? What parallels do they draw?
Well, in addition to Christian verses like Matthew 5.44 and Romans 12.19, bless those who persecute you, they bring in the Buddhist Dhammapada 5, which teaches that hatred can't be overcome with more hatred, only with love.
Makes sense. What about from the other traditions?
From Islam, they offer Quran 41.34, which advises responding to evil with good, even suggesting it can turn enemies into friends. And from Hinduism, they cite Bhagavad Gita 16.3, which lists nonviolence, equanimity, and compassion as divine qualities.
So emphasizing love as a powerful force for transformation.
Exactly. And then for trust in God's provision, alongside verses like Matthew 6.33 and Philippians 4.1, they reference the Buddhist Dhammapada 222, which advises against worrying about the future.
Okay, so letting go of anxiety.
Right. Then from Islam, it's Quran 65.3, which assures that God will always provide a way out for those who trust in him. And from Hinduism, they use Bhagavad Gita 9.22, which talks about God taking care of those devoted to him.
So that reliance on a higher power for support.
Yes, and then for generosity and reciprocity, in addition to Luke 6.38 and 2 Corinthians 9.6, they mention the Buddhist Dhammapada 177, which talks about the happiness found in giving.
So generosity leading to joy.
Right, and from Islam, they use Quran 2.261, which describes how a single grain can multiply many times over. It's a parable about the rewards of giving.
I like that. And from Hinduism.
They bring in Bhagavad Gita 17.20, which emphasizes the purity of giving without expecting anything in return.
It's amazing how that idea of selfless giving is so widespread. Okay, and what about for the power of silence?
So, along with James 1.19 and Proverbs 17.28, they highlight the Buddhist Dhammapada 234, which says even a fool can seem wise if he remains silent.
Silence as a mask for foolishness, or maybe a path to wisdom.
Right, it could be both.
Okay.
Then from Islam, it's Quran 33.70, which calls for speaking justly and rightly.
So choosing words carefully.
Exactly. And from Hinduism, they use Bhagavad Gita 13.31, which includes silence as an aspect of wisdom.
Wow, so many different traditions recognizing the power of silence. And that wraps up the respond section.
Yes, and it really drives home the point that even though these belief systems are different, they share a lot of core values.
It's a great reminder that we might have more in common than we realize. Well, I think we've really gotten to the heart of this chapter today, the impartial way. We've explored those key themes of impartiality, unconditional love, trust in a greater provision, generosity, and the wisdom of silence. And we've even looked at how those ideas resonate with other faith traditions.
Absolutely. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you a much deeper understanding of these principles and how they're presented in this Christian context.
It certainly has for me. And as you reflect on all this, on these common threads across these diverse paths, what does it say about our shared human experience, our interconnectedness? It's a question worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.